Thank you again, friends. I'm really honored you're here, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Dr. Josh Packard, who'll take us through the presentation today. Thanks. Looking forward to your questions at the end.
Hey, thanks, Marta. That was really great. It's lovely to hear you call me, or interesting to hear you call me doctor. That's I can't even get my own students to call me doctor. That was something. Folks, I couldn't be more excited to be here. The State of Religion and Young People, Relational Authority for 2020. This represents the culmination of a year's worth of work at Springtide, and our first year's worth of work at Springtide. 10,000 surveys, over 150 interviews of 13 to 25-year-olds. It's the largest data set of its kind. So in some ways we know, things that, and I'll share things here that nobody else really knows yet. And I've been seeing them over the last few months as they come together in the analysis and then the design. And I'm really thrilled to share them with you today. Full disclosure though, years ago, I gave what I thought was going to be the most intimidating presentation of my life, because I was giving a webinar for a book I had written, and my mom logged on. So that was some kind of pressure. But today in this audience, there's over 1,000 people registered. There's 125 of you right now. Sitting in the 125 who are actually present is my campus pastor. So I'm really feeling this moment. Greg, I hope I make you proud. All right. So what do we mean about the state of religion and young people? First, before we dive into the content, I want to share with you a little bit about where we come from at Springtide and why we even embarked on such a project in the first place. So at Springtide, we say that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. And that mission statement alone takes us into some wild places. So we don't come at this through the lens of a particular denomination or a particular church or even a particular faith tradition, because increasingly we understand that young people are not coming at their faith, and they're not asking these really important questions through those lenses themselves. As somebody said to me a few years ago that really resonated with me, they said, it's not that young people are leaving the church, they're not in it to begin with. But I think the flip side of that coin is that it doesn't mean that young people aren't interested in what are essentially religious questions. Why am I on this earth? What should I do with my life? And this trickles into, what values, what things do I hold dear? How do I enact those things? This trickles into all of their major decisions. And as we started talking with them directly, instead of just assuming a lot of things about them, we realized how multifaceted and how multidimensional their faith is. So at Springtide, we go where they are. We go where young people are asking those kinds of questions. A big component of what we do is surveying, but we have conversations too. So Marta mentioned we did, over 150 in-depth interviews in support of this study. So it's comprehensive, and it's more than that, it's important. And it's important because we really have to be attending to young people wherever they're at, especially as their lives, as we're going to see in a moment, don't get filtered through these institutional pathways that would naturally bring them into contact with adults who care about them. Because that's the other thing that we kept hearing. While on the one hand, we understand that young people are asking these questions, they're often doing it in the absence of trusted adults in their lives. And this is not because there are not trusted adults. Again, there are 1,100 that registered for today's webinar, 130 of you taking the time to watch it live. The adults are out there, but the sort of traditional pathways that used to bring those adults into contact with those young people, those have been reformed in ways that I don't think that we're doing a very good job of understanding. And so that's really what this report is about. And the findings from the evidence and the data here are pretty clear. The religious lives of 13 to 25-year-olds are more complex than ever. And we need to start focusing on their behaviors and their relationships more so than just checked boxes or categories. I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. But before that, I want to share with you sort of some of the insides of this report that I'm so excited to have come out into people's hands. And there's two ways that you're going to be able to get this. One is going to be digitally, and that's going to be hosted on our website. We hope it'll ideally, if we can get the technology worked out here, it'll be on iBooks, the Apple bookstore soon. And that's free. It's going to be a free download thanks to a very generous donation that we've gotten from a family foundation. And then the print version is available for pre-order right now on Amazon, and that's just covering the costs of printing and shipping. So I think it's at a $10 price point. So that's please tell your friends about it, share it. We're trying to get this distributed as widely as we can because we think there's important information inside of it. And the design of it is great. It's, as Marta said, even though we're a research institute, we're never simply trying to be interesting, we're trying to be useful. So throughout the pages of this report, in addition to this amazing design that our team has done around the narrative, we have these tide-turning tips that are rooted in the social and behavioral sciences that help you enact these values and put these things into practice in real and tangible ways. We've got links to videos that we've recorded with our research advisory board, who many of whom are working in direct capacity in a wide array of contexts. We've got podcast links. We've got a closer look at politics, virtual environments, careers, current events. We've got blogs, some of which are written through our stay-at-home creativity contest by young people themselves, and interviews. One of the things I'm most excited about, though, in support of this is, as we do for every study that we release, we've done a season of our podcast, The Voices of Young People. And this season, season 3 of The Voices of Young People, is unfiltered. So there's no interviewer. I come on at the beginning of the episode, I give a little overview of who this person is, and then it's just them. It's it's 10 episodes of young people. I want to make sure, because we bounced around the number. 10 episodes of young people describing their faith life in their firsthand accounts. What's important to them, how do they live it out, how do they enact it, and we'll be releasing these one a week over the coming weeks. And I think it's a really important and useful way for trying to get a handle on the really diverse experiences and concerns and ways that faith life intersects with daily life of young people. So I'm thrilled about that, that we have that to be able to offer for this. So with all of that in mind, what's in the book? What did we learn? Well, I think that actually starts with a story. And I don't typically, I'm, as Marta mentioned by calling me doctor, I have a PhD, and it's a research institute. And I've already explained that, we go across all kinds of institutional boundaries. So I don't often start a presentation about research with a story about my personal life, but I think it's really relevant here. When I was in middle school, I grew up in a household that was largely agnostic until a certain point. At some point, for whatever reason, my parents got religion and took me to church. And in the suburbs, that was not uncommon. I went to a Christian church, and we were sort of church shopping, looking around for the very first time. And I remember this youth pastor came up to me and he said, "Son, are you a believer?" And I looked at him, mustering up all of the 13 or 14-year-old courage that I could, so I could formulate some really articulate answer. And I basically gave some verbal version of this emoji, which is, I don't know, sometimes, maybe, why, in what? There were just so many questions flooding my mind, and I'm sure I stammered into something that was not particularly articulate or useful. What was really interesting to me, though, is not that particular story in an isolated way, is that when I got to college, which is for many people, including me, one of the most diverse times that they're going to have in their lives, either because of the people that they're around or the classes they take. I had the opportunity to come into contact with a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different faith backgrounds. And it turned out that, whether I was talking to people who had no religion, or if we were talking to, if I was hanging out with people who had grown up in a Jewish household, they had all had some version of this, that at some point, somebody, usually an adult, had asked them some version of the question that I got asked. Just depending on the context, it would shift. And it not only was it somewhat off-putting for all of us in that moment, we all sort of had the same kind of reaction, which is, I'm not sure what good that does. Well, I mean, what if I had answered it to say yes? And what if I'd answered it to say no? I'm not sure that ultimately tells you anything about who I am or what the next part of our conversation should be. And that was not only true across that board, but what I came to realize as I graduated from my undergrad and went and got a PhD in sociology and focused on religion, was that version, like we're basically, over the last 15 or 20 years, we've been having a national version of that conversation. And it's incredibly unfortunate. So the national version of that conversation looks largely like this, and we call them the nuns or the unaffiliated. This is the General Social Survey, but Pew and Gallup have largely the same numbers. These are broken out by age. And you see what's happened here since 1980 to 2018. Many of you have already seen this in other contexts because you're people who show up to webinars like this, frankly, and you care about these kinds of things. And maybe there's some hand wringing and teeth gnashing at the rise of the nuns, especially among young people. Our own research at Springtide, which actually extends this research down to 13-year-olds because instead of 18 like most other places, confirms that it's largely the same thing. 39% of 13 to 25-year-olds say that they are unaffiliated. But just like the conversation that I had and my friends had when they were younger, I don't know what you do with this information. I'm not sure what good it is to you, because that number of 39% is not likely to be 39% in your context. And you are not working with young people across the country. As I've said to pastors, once I was like, you are not the pastor to the country. So what is the use in trying to understand these global categories and fretting over a percentage or 2 or 3 increase or decrease? The sociologist Howard Becker helps us to understand why these categories are so unhelpful. He said, to put it very succinctly, he says they're not types of people, there are types of activities. Which is to say that, of course, we can try and categorize people. He uses this famously in this notion of deviance, to say like, well, what if we can say that somebody is a deviant or not a deviant? What is that? How do we draw those boundaries, and what does that even mean? In my own classes, I use this example. I have my students raise their hand if they consider themselves to be a good friend, and everybody in my class raises their hand. And then I ask them, I say, okay, so if you've ever, acted poorly towards one of your friends, or maybe even lied to them, or maybe even like you've actually sort of like stolen, quote unquote, a significant other from them, or done something, devious, or talked behind their back, put your hand down. And everybody in the class puts their hands down. So we're stuck with this situation where, like, everybody said they were a good friend, and they also just admitted to lying to their friends. To illustrate this point, that of course, like, we can try and draw boxes around people, but if we're not actually understanding the kinds of activities that lead up to a particular decision or action or behavior, then we don't know how to interact with them in a productive way. All we're left doing is trying to say, yes, good friend, no, bad friend, and come up with some arbitrary characteristics around that. Are you a believer? Let me show you what that looks like at a national scale, because I think that we are having largely the wrong conversation in this country when it comes to the faith lives of 13 to 25-year-olds. We are having a conversation that is one of affiliation and not one of belief and identity and behavior. So here's how, and here's why those categories aren't as useful as they once were. So it used to be that we lived in a world that, and this is, I mean, within many of your lifetimes, this is just a few decades ago, that we lived in a world where there was relatively simple. A few dominant institutions governed our lives. There were schools and religious institutions, and I couldn't figure out what the icon would be for a club. So there's a club in places where we work, and that was more or less it. And we were pretty happy to claim that if we went to that school and graduated from it, or if we belonged to this church, or if we worked at that place, or spent time at this club, that was largely who we were. Our attendance was a signal of a category that we belonged to. They were us. And in that world, all that you have to do to have influence is to align yourselves with one of those institutions, or a combination of them if you can, and you automatically get authority or influence over the people who identify with that institution, sometimes formally in the case of a workplace, but sometimes informally in the case of a youth pastor. And it seems pretty straightforward and pretty easy. You get a title, you get a credential, you get a position, and you don't have, the rest is sort of all downhill from there. But that's not largely the world that we live in anymore. In fact, the world that we live in now it is not one where we have a whole lot of trust in these kinds of institutions. So it's instead of living inside of them, instead of those institutions and identities living inside of us, what we've got is a place where a situation where we don't trust those things. So even when we participate, we don't always claim an identity with them. When we ask young people specifically about trust in those kinds of institutions, what you see here is, a bunch of grouping between 4 and 5, but this is on a 10-point scale. And probably what you're mostly going to be paying attention to is the organized religion one. And even though organized religion is, middle or towards the top even, nobody's faring very well at all, because that is the major shift that has happened over the last 3, 4, 5 decades. We've got good data going back on this for a while. And it's true more so with young people even than with adults. Instead, what we've got are these like contradictory, shifting things. The reality is that we often default to being transactional in our relationships, assuming that trust is given because we have one of these positions. But we have to earn it, because what we know from our data is that 83% of young people say they are more likely to take advice from someone who cares about them. In other words, that having the title is not the thing that causes them to have influence. 32% say that impressive job titles do not matter to them. These things that we as adults work so hard to get, young people find to be largely irrelevant. So much for me having a PhD. 14% say that if someone has an impressive job title, they implicitly do not trust them, which is sort of counterintuitive. That's the world that we're living in now. And so in that world, where we don't have this like simplified 4 dominant institutions and we can align with one of them. Instead, what we've got is this much more complex world where we're adding all kinds of other things, including like national identities and social identities and other environments to what makes up who we are. Well, in this world, and combining with a little trust, the more that you align yourself with an institution, the less authority, the less influence that you're going to get in the life of a young person. So we keep like running back to these old patterns. We keep doubling down into these old behaviors because that's what worked at one time. Like we go back to say like, man, things are just not as great as they used to be. Like I don't have the same attendance that I used to have. I don't have as many young people coming to my events. I don't seem to have as many good conversations with them. Why is that? Well, somebody will pipe up. We used to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had a flourishing youth group. Let's do the stuff that we did then because it'll definitely work now. And if the world had not changed, I would say you're completely right. If you would just do the stuff now that you did then, you would be as successful now as maybe you once were. But we're in a completely different world. We're in a world where you have so many more influences in a person's life. They're not inclined to take bits and pieces of those attendances and affiliations as being part of their identity and living inside their heart. In fact, they're inclined to not trust those institutions as having their best interests in mind. So the more you double down on those old ways of doing things, the less likely that you are to actually create the kinds of relationships that young people need, be the kind of trusted adult in their lives that they really want. So as these institutions like circulate around them and young people grab bits and pieces of them, we have to find a way to move out of those spaces and move into the hearts and lives of young people. So if we look at this, just through the affiliation data, we see all kinds of contradictions in the ways that this shows up, and further evidence for why we shouldn't just be thinking about this in terms of categories. So 52% of young people have little trust in organized religion, even when they claim to be religiously affiliated. So in other words, they're raising their hand to say, yeah, I'm Muslim, or yes, I'm Christian. And of those groups of people, half of them are saying they have little to no trust in organized religion. 20% of young people who tell us they are affiliated with a religious tradition also tell us that they are not, however, a religious person. There's a variety of reasons for that. Some of that same sort of like social acceptance that was present when I was a young person growing up is not there for people to want to claim. There's a stigma now that people don't want to claim those identities, but also they're rooting out those things and separating them. They're making those two different things, that affiliating with a tradition and being a religious person are not necessarily one and the same. And nearly a third of affiliated young people told us they do not think it's important to have a faith community, that they can be faithful on their own. 33% of affiliated young people attend religious services once a year or less. So just 1 in 3. And over 1 in 5 young people who tell us that they are affiliated with a religious tradition also tell us that they don't try to live out their religious beliefs on a day day-to-day basis, which is super, super interesting. So we've got a much more complex and varied picture than the simple box of affiliation or unaffiliation would have us believe. Monica tells us, when asked about her faith and how she would describe it, she says, I guess if you have to put a label on it, Christian. But with everything in today's world, I literally don't know. I just think spiritual, maybe, question mark. And we heard this time and again when we interviewed young people, but it's not just that way for affiliated young people. It's the same story largely for unaffiliated young people. So as much as we would be sort of off the mark to say like, oh, if somebody claims an affiliation, or even if they're attending, some of our events, then we can probably assume or know some things about them, which is not true. The same is also true for unaffiliated young people. Just because they're not coming or because they don't claim an affiliation with a religious tradition doesn't mean that they aren't open to the conversation. These people are no more uniform than their affiliated counterparts. 60% of unaffiliated young people say they are at least slightly spiritual. 28% of young people say that they try to live out their religious beliefs in their daily lives. So you got 1 in 4 people claiming no affiliation of 13 to 25-year-olds, but still trying to live out some religious beliefs in their daily lives. I don't know how they're doing it, right? Like, this is a follow-up study that I'm really interested in, but we didn't get a chance to dig into this year. If you've got 1 in 4 unaffiliated people saying that they're trying to sort of like be guided by some religious beliefs in their daily lives, guided by whom or what? Like, it begs all kinds of questions, and I think opens up all kinds of opportunities once we understand that young people are out there trying to navigate these situations in many respects on their own, or at least without the sort of traditional institutional supports. 1 in 5 unaffiliated young people say that they attend religious gatherings at least once a month, which makes you wonder what's going on at those religious gatherings. 1 in 10 of unaffiliated young people say that they have become more religious over the last 5 years. And 38% of unaffiliated young people say that they are religious. In other words, when we are drawing out those institutions and saying that they don't live in young people's hearts, like, they just aren't automatically imparting those things into their identities. So if we need to move out of this conversation about boxes and categories, well, what is actually revealing about their faith lives? What is important to them if it isn't affiliation and unaffiliation? Well, relationships largely tell the story of where young people are at in their faith lives. And it's largely the way that if we're going to make an impact in their lives, that we need to be sort of camping out. So 27%, about 1 in 4 of young people have 1 or fewer adults in their life that they can turn to if they need to talk. That number is lower for younger ages, for probably understandable reasons. Many of them are still in their homes. Home is not always a safe or good place, so I understand that, but it certainly increases the odds. 31% of 18 to 25-year-olds. So you've got, like, in this super important time of life where you're undergoing so many transitions, whether it's from college to high school or nobody's going that way, high school to college, excuse me, or high school into the workforce, or increasingly, as I see with my students at the university where I work, it's both. Like, they're in some sort of liminal, marginalized state where they're maybe trying to start a career, or at least trying to get by, and also going to school and doing all this exploration. Up to 25, we even see the very beginnings of young people who are beginning to get married and maybe starting families. They don't have any, a third of them have 1 or fewer trusted adult in their life that they could turn to talk. And that number, as we outlined in our study Belonging that came out in February, that number is troubling and raises all kinds of risk factors. There are emotional, spiritual, physical health consequences that come with that kind of disconnection. And in order to really get into this protective area, what we want to have are young people connected with 3 or ideally up to 5 relationships with trusted adults. 1 is troubling. 69% of young people have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions in a regular day. The only reason I knew to include this question, we let them self-define meaningful. We gave them examples. I know somebody's going to ask. In parentheses, we said a meaningful interaction. In other words, not just talking about the weather or saying, hi, how are you? I knew to include this question because years ago, the campus ministers at the university where I work, they came to us in the sociology department and said, we'd like to do a survey. And so we helped them put together questions. And my students who worked on the survey said, okay, well, they want to ask a question about, do they have any conversations, meaningful interactions on a daily basis. And like, great, just, the first range is from like 1 to 5 and then 6 to 10 and then so on and so forth. And the students were like, no, we need a category at the bottom that is 0. And then the next category needs to be 1. And I told them they were crazy. Like, nobody's living on a college campus around other students all the time and having one meaningful interaction on a daily basis. And I told them I'd buy them all coffee if it was even in the top 3. So long story short, I was out $70 for 4 lattes at Starbucks because that was the number 1 category. The number 1 category was 1 or 2. I can't remember which exactly it was, but it was astonishingly low. And that largely replicates itself here. So it's paradoxical because we think of young people as being super connected, and it's true, they are very connected, but that connection doesn't always lead to meaning. 41% depend on a close relationship to help them find meaning and purpose in their lives. So you can see the paradox here between these two numbers. If there's not a whole lot of meaningful conversations, if 1 in 4 don't have a trusted adult in their lives, but half of them nearly are depending on these, well, there's a real problem, and I would argue an opportunity for people like you to make a real difference in their lives. This gets further complicated when we start coupling all of this data together. So when we start looking at who those adults actually are that they could turn to, 74% say have a parent or guardian. I would want that number to be higher, but I understand it. And then we get down to religious leaders, all the way there, third from the bottom. Only 8% of the young people in our surveys told us that they had a religious leader that they could turn to if they needed help. And I don't mean to be too alarmist about this, but I would say that is simply not good enough. That for whatever, and there's no particular blame placed here as much as it is just to say, like, that's a number that needs to change. At Springtide, while we're not advocating for a particular faith or religious tradition, we do firmly believe that young people having a faith life, having a spiritual life that is augmented and supported by trusted adults is a better version of life. And we would want to see that number go up. Megan says, nobody cares. She told us nobody is really listening. We heard this over and over, that adults in her life, in young people's lives, want to do a lot of talking and telling, sometimes showing, but very little actual listening. And listening is so often the thing that communicates care and concern. We know that that's crucial and critical because it's a 100-year-old lesson in sociology that belonging precedes believing, that you can't get a sustainable belief out of somebody unless they feel a sense of belonging first. And so we really need to get them, young people, to a place where they feel the sense of belonging so that they can begin to formulate what their beliefs are in a durable way. And I imagine that each of you are sitting there from your perspective thinking like that you would like to have some influence maybe over what those beliefs are. Well, it starts by making sure that they have a sense of belonging, that they are connected in a relational way. So that's why we gave the subtitle for this year's report, Relational Authority, because it is not just that you need to have more relationships with young people. What we were able to uncover in the research was that there are particular kinds of relationships that matter more. And there are ways that we can do this that are not manipulative, that are not, but rather that focus on understanding that we can communicate our natural care and concern as trusted adults to young people in a way that they perceive as care and concern, because that pathway has largely been altered. Instead of relying on those institutional connections where the implication would be like, look how hard I worked and sacrificed to get to be in this position so that I could be in front of you, because they don't trust that anymore. We need to replace those institutions with people. Those people are what actually live in the hearts of young people. They're the ones that is how young people are forming their identity, not through their institutional ties and connections, but through the adults that they come into contact with, who are maybe tied back in some way to those institutions. Even my own students do not care about my role as a professor until they know that I care about them as students and their success in the classroom, in whatever way that may look. So not all of my students are there in the classroom to try and get a great grade in the class. Some of them are there because they're trying to get by and make ends meet. And I have to take the time to understand that and know that before they'll give me their best effort. I think you all have seen this and sensed it. Well, what this research allows us to do, though, is to get into the how. So when we talk about this new model of relational authority, well, it relies largely on bringing together the solidarity of sameness and the solidarity of difference. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but social scientists break these down into a couple of different ways and different eras. The solidarity of sameness is that basically says that I can identify with you and have influence over your life when our lives are largely the same, when our lived experiences are things that we can say are basically like, I know you because you've lived through the same thing that I've lived through. And that was most of the way that like authority, even at the uppermost levels in our societies, worked, until we started splitting up around the Industrial Revolution and moving to cities and these very fractured kinds of family arrangements and work arrangements and governing relationships. So now in our society, we rely largely on this solidarity of difference or interdependence, where, you know, we have dentists who do dentistry, but they don't preach on Sundays or Fridays. We have preachers for those things. We have people who are writers who write. We have people who are editors who edit them. So all of our world that we live in today has been largely broken apart from that shared lived experience. And the way that we have authority in this modern world is by credential or position or title. We get certified, in other words, in some way. Without going too far down that rabbit hole, then, if those credentials and those certifications don't matter, but we know that relationships are not enough, what young people keep telling us is that they want to know that you understand them and that you're listening and that you care about them, but that your expertise also matters. We need some way of bringing those things together. And that's what relational authority is. And it consists of 5 components: listening, transparency, integrity, care, and expertise. Young people do not want you to be their friends. They have plenty of friends. Their friends give them sometimes terrible advice. Their friends do sometimes awful things to them. They don't want more friends, especially from adults. What they want are adults who are experts, but who are also doing these relational things in very intentional ways. 65% of young people agree with the statement that a person's expertise doesn't matter if they don't care about me. So if you're not communicating that care in a way that can be perceived, then they're not going to listen to all the expert advice that you might have, all the knowledge that you might have about your sacred text or your rituals or those things that you think are really important. You'll never get to a conversation that matters if they don't think you care first. Alex, the reason I stayed at my church is because of my mentor. She's very smart, knows everything about the Bible. Nope, that's not what she said at all. She said she's very hospitable, very loving, very forgiving, non-judgmental, and she has been so gracious. You don't get a chance to convey all that expertise if you're not first hospitable, loving, forgiving, non-judgmental, and gracious. Those are the kinds of relational things that young people need before they're going to stick around long enough for that expertise to come into play. I'll be the first one to tell you that if you don't follow it up with the expertise, it's largely going to be empty. It's not going to matter in the long run. But expertise alone is not enough. And believe me, again, I wish that it were. I've got a PhD. I've been a professor for a while before coming to this work side. I really wish that expertise alone was enough, but it isn't. So what do these look like? Well, the first one, listening. And we're not going to go through every one of these data points because mostly I'm presenting them as they're largely the same. We've got about 8 in 10 young people telling us that they trust someone who remembers things they've shared. They trust someone who takes the time to hear what they have to say. They feel listened to and people show that they care about them. So like the data here are basically overwhelming that you probably can't be doing too much listening. But listening of a certain kind. So when communication researchers look at like what kind of listening matters, well, it's often little things in the nonverbal communication that we can do, especially with young people who are very sensitive to these things in an intuitive way that we maybe would sort of skirt over. And one of those things is called having an open posture. So, that can be, that posture in this literal sense can be making sure that you're not sitting with your arms crossed and your legs folded and, just waiting for the young person to get done talking so you can say something. But there's also this other way of having that posture, which is to always be ready with a follow-up question that doesn't drive back to your agenda, but that gets the young person to dig deeper. So one of these, these can be as simple as tell me more about that experience. I use this all the time with my students, and I have been using this all the time with my students in my office hours, just so I can get to know them better, because they're so unused to being asked a question that their first answer is often not very deep. They're not used to adults caring. And so we have to retrain them to be around an adult who cares about them. And one of the ways that we do that is by not taking those first answers as good enough, but digging deeper. Next one, transparency. Again, 80% of young people saying that they trust someone who shares things about their own lives, and 80% trust those who understand their lived experiences. So being transparent about who you are, knowing that you don't have to always present a perfect picture or an idealized picture is critical. What happens to you, what happens in these moments scientifically is that we're establishing what social scientists call norms of reciprocity. Norms of reciprocity are basically that when I do something for you, it sort of creates this conceptual debt that you owe me and that you want to match or repay me. And again, as we're out of practice with this with most young people, what we need to do is to open up by sharing something about ourselves. In some ways, that establishes a trusted environment, but it also creates this subtle invitation for young people to say like, oh, I want to match that. It happens all the time, both in some sort of like transactional ways in our lives where somebody actually lends you $1 and you know that just later you don't have to give them the $1 back exactly, but you might give them a cup of coffee or something. But it also happens in all these kinds of subtle ways where if you see somebody giving grace to you in a moment, or that maybe you weren't acting your best, you're more inclined to do that for them in the future. Well, the same is true in terms of forming relationships here with young people. When you're transparent with them, you're subtly encouraging them to be transparent with you. And that obviously is one of the crucial steps towards having a real transformational as opposed to just transactional relationship. Another important reason for transparency is that we move people, when we're transparent with them, we move them from an out-group member to being an in-group member, and they begin to see us as somebody that they belong to. And when that happens, we give in-group members a lot more leeway, a lot more space. They get to speak into our lives. We're more forgiving of them when they make mistakes, and that's both good for you to be forgiving and giving leeway to young people, but it's really critical that young people do that for you. So that they can begin to see you as a real person and not just this, adult figure in their lives. It's absolutely critical. Integrity. 80% of young people trust someone who admits when they're wrong. And the percentage of young people who tell us that they trust people who model and practice integrity through following up, following through, and being accountable and being authentic is off the charts. It's over 90%. This comes directly from the data. Then follow up, follow through, be accountable, be authentic. This is the way we build integrity with young people. We have to be careful about the commitments that we make because we want to be sure that we can follow through with them, whether it's saying that we'll show up at a certain place or call them at a certain time, asking them about things, following through, owning up when we didn't come through in the way that we had hoped to or wanted to, being accountable in that way. We've got care. How do we do care though? That's a pretty amorphous one. How do young people experience care? Well, it's really, a lot of this is about time. So 87% of young people saying that they trust adults who take time to foster relationships. That's what communicates care. Adults are very busy and young people know that. And we spend time on the things that we care about. And so young people are telling us very directly in lots of ways that adults need to make time for them in their lives. It's not just effort. It's not behind the scenes things. They need to know that they're taking the time to foster a relationship with them. Even making the effort, even if it doesn't always seem like at first you're making progress, the effort matters. 80% of young people say they will trust someone they believe cares about them, almost regardless of anything else. It's sort of unbelievable. Camille illustrates this. She said, I had a very few difficult experiences during my undergraduate years because of my health, which meant my relationships to teachers weren't always a matter of advancing a career. They were a matter of making sure I was healthy and safe and all of those things. And I think that's why radical empathy, which is a term that I love, was so huge for me. I was coming into contact with new identities and they were navigating space with me as a part of their support for me. In other words, in these moments that are so tumultuous that she's describing, I mean, she's packing a lot even into this one paragraph. What she's communicating is that these people cared about her with her, not telling her what to do, prescribing action, but navigating space with me as a part of their support for me. Radical empathy, not just in the moment to open up a space for an adult to talk, but radically living out life with Camille was the thing that changed her life. That was the pivot moment for her. But again, all this doesn't matter if we don't at some point and in some way bring expertise into this equation. 84% of young people say they trust someone who not only knows a lot, but also uses that knowledge to help them. So expertise definitely still matters. Young people do not want you to be their friends. They want you to be their guide, their mentor, their coach, their teacher, not their buddy. So even in that quote then from Camille, what we're seeing is that she's still turning to teachers to do that work. She knows that what she needs in that moment is not just help in the classroom. She needed help navigating life. And that's why those teachers ended up being so important for her, not because they pushed her, in her words, to get a better grade, but because they were living and helping her navigate all of these situations. So we put this all together then into this model of relational authority, and we dig deeper into each one of these in the overall report. But one thing I wanted to show you here as we come to the end is this, like when we get adults who can practice all 5 of those things, we get numbers that are really, I mean, these are off the charts numbers. This is how young people at various ages indicate trust based on the 5 dimensions of relational authority. So when we start combining them, when we start putting them together, we see that in the bottom one, relational authority overall, well, we get something close to 90% of young people saying that they would trust an adult in their life who exhibited these 5 characteristics or these 5 dimensions. So again, off the chart. So it's not just about, like, you know, it both is and is not just about showing up and listening. There are other things that we need to be doing in combination with that so we can have the relational part, and we need to be bringing our expertise to that so that we can have some authority to actually speak into their lives. All right, everybody, thank you so much. This has been super. I've really enjoyed the chance to get to share some of that. I know that we've got some questions that have been popping up in the Q&A and in other places. Marta, I'm excited to hear some of them. Here's the social media handles, so you can be in contact with us in the coming weeks, months, and years. This is an annual project rather that we're going to be producing. So this is 2020. We'll be back next year and the year after and the year after.
Thanks, Josh. We did get some great questions in. The first one I'm popping into the chat so people can see it visually as well, but it's, how can I help build trust and positive connections with the youth in my own faith community while we aren't meeting in person?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we've been fielding a lot of these over the last months, as obviously we've been in COVID and lockdown and many places not having services, and it looks like might be that way for a while. The most successful places, I'll say, have been the ones that know who they are. One of our interns, Damaris, I think was a couple of weeks ago, when she said there's a difference between youth ministry and youth group. She comes out of a Catholic tradition. And she's like, really understanding that what we're doing and what is needed in this moment is not youth group, but is youth ministry. And my mind was sort of blown by that. It was such a simple way of putting it. And so what we're seeing from those people who really understand that what they need to be doing as youth ministry is that they're on the phone a lot. I mean, they're on social media a lot. They're leaving care packages on people's front doors. They're finding ways to do, there's a lot of video game ministry going on. And I know some of you might not necessarily be up for that. Goodness knows I wouldn't be up for that. Because, I have a high tolerance for embarrassment, but I'm not sure that I'm interested in that level of it. But I think, there are ways, we can be socially distant in people's yards. There's obviously safety concerns that we have to navigate when we're doing digital communication that way. I've seen, some examples of parachurch ministries who are contacting parents first to say, hey, I'm going to be contacting your young person, if that's okay, your son or daughter. If that's okay with you, I'll record the conversation if you want to watch it. So we have to navigate the safety concerns for sure. But there has to be ways that we can be reaching out to them through these digital mediums to make sure that they're connected for the long haul.
Great. Next question, I'm also popping in the chat. Have we figured out why adults aren't listening?
Well, I don't think Marta, I don't know, you were a youth director for a while too. I don't think it is that, so I'm curious about your thoughts here, but I don't think it isn't that adults aren't listening. It's that I think the structures that we have in place right now often don't allow them to listen. I mean, so many of the ministries that have been built across different faith traditions, but especially out of the Christian context that I've come out of, they were really effective in their day. Just like Blockbuster was a really great, place to shop for movies back in the day. But that model just doesn't work now. And it's not because people have stopped watching movies. There's just a different world that we live in. And so I think those models need to change. And that model that I'm referring to is largely that, like, put on a lock-in and a big event, and then like the youth pastor stands up for 20 minutes, or do a confirmation class, and we see them once a week for an hour. And like, I'm not sure that model allows you to really do deep listening when largely the thing is structured around you talking.
Yeah, I hear that. We got a question that said, are there any differences we should be mindful of between white or Black, Indigenous, people of color, young people?
Yeah, this is a super important question because there are certainly differences. Race is an issue, as well as ethnicity and gender. I mean, these are issues that cut right to the core of people's identity, what social scientists call their master status, meaning that everything gets filtered through it. One of the things I'm really excited about for this report is assuming that the team, which is literally working on this as we speak, can get all the digital integrations to work, we should have the ability in the digital version of the State of Religion and Young People to actually click in and toggle on and off options for the data so that you can look at those breakdowns as you want. Now, we didn't see massive differences between those groups on some of those key characteristics that I was talking about here in terms of affiliation and unaffiliation, but that doesn't mean that there are not differences that impact their faith lives. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be sort of attuned to them. For the reality, of course, is that for a lot of us, given how segregated religious institutions tend to be, it's, if you're working in a multicultural or multi-faith setting, you're probably one of the lucky ones. So I think it's useful to know that, especially as we talk about getting out of our churches more and into contact with more people who aren't just coming into our buildings. It's important that we attend to those things and dig into them in ways that they might not otherwise come across our radar.
This question is great. I'm having trouble copying it, but I'm going to read it. I've noticed that my daughter, early 20s, and her friends love to explore religion in a deep way, like going on pilgrimages on the Camino de Santiago to Pakistan or Israel. They also love exploring others' religions, but not in an evangelizing sort of way. It's a way of exploring each other's and their own identity. Is Gen Z a group of spiritual deep divers?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that I would like to be friends with your daughter and have her take me on these trips if she is ever interested. Those sound amazing. There's the science here is really interesting. I mean, the research around, like, I'm stumbling a little bit because I want to be very careful. I think that we run the risk of painting them as sort of like a jack of all trades but master of none. That they're sort of like almost treating religion as a buffet, and like, oh yeah, I'll take, like, meditation from here, and I'll take sacraments from here and prayer from here. And that's not the picture that I think is the accurate one. Neither is it accurate, I think, to characterize Gen Z as exploring a lot of things like a menu, to continue the food analogy, and then to ultimately settle on one moving forward. Instead, I think that the truth is somewhere much in the middle. Experiences are at all, I mean, maybe to the extent of taking actual pilgrimages is a little bit extreme, but the notion that young people are interested in using each other as a source of knowledge, and talking about issues around faith and spirituality and religion as a way to get to understand an individual person, I think that is incredibly common. And that's why I think we see transparency showing up here, because that's one of the ways that they want to get to know you and know that you care about them, is by sharing, like, what has been the evolution of your faith over time. So everything, again, like, even when it comes to these big conversations, but around friendships, like, these are all filtered through this relationship building. In some ways, what's happening with this loss of institutional trust is that the world is getting much more small. It's getting, wait, is that right? It's getting much smaller. It is getting much more intimate, and much more micro in terms of the relationships that we actually care about.
Great. Next question is, how can those who train and minister to the ministers in the trenches, so the people actually on the ground, help them to see the need for relational authority over institutional authority and wander into practicing that?
Okay, so what we've largely, as we've been living through this, like, trust revolution, this is not just in the church, but as you saw in that graph, it's for all institutions. And other institutions have, I think, been more on top of this than the church. They've been quicker to respond. That's not entirely surprising. I mean, I don't know that religious institutions should be super quick to respond to every social trend that comes their way. This one is real and is sticking away. It is not sticking around. It's not a fad. It's not going to go away. But if churches are a little bit behind the times, seminaries and places, religious education places, tend to be even further behind than churches. And this is, we're not doing, as I've been around, and we're doing focus groups right now with youth ministers. You can go to our website and see where you can sign up for those if you're interested. We're not doing a very good job of helping our young people in ministry contexts and settings articulate success beyond numbers. And I think, numbers and size of your youth group and those kinds of things, like those were really great indicators of success back when we lived in this world of institutional trust. But as we articulated in belonging, like there's a large percentage of young people who come, in fact, not just large percentage, there was statistically no difference in terms of a sense of belonging for the young people who attended versus the ones who didn't. So just because people are attending or coming doesn't mean they actually feel connected to you. Those old measures are no longer good indicators of what we actually care about, which I would imagine what we actually care about is spiritual transformation. So what we need to be doing is helping these young people in ministry, these people who, or people who are trying to pivot now later in their career in this new reality, to get new metrics and ways of understanding what success looks like. I think we need to shift that conversation away from, as Becker was saying, these types and categories, and more towards the process. Where is the young person right now? Where are they when they're done with you? Have they strengthened? Are they have their faith life? Do they have a better understanding of what's going on with them spiritually? Are they more able to articulate the questions and concerns that they have? These are the kinds of markers of success that will ultimately yield long-lasting relationships with them. But we don't track those things. We don't measure them. We don't report them back to church council or to our bosses or to any sort of authority. What we do is count. We count young people. And I don't think that there could be a more misleading indicator than the count of young people who show up at your events. I firmly believe that if you practice relational authority, you're going to see your numbers go up. But if you're driven by those numbers, if that's the indicator that you're looking at, then you'll never be a relational authority, and you ultimately won't have that kind of increase that you're looking for.
I think we have time for one more. I'm popping it in the chat here. I agree the lacking number of trusted adults for young people is troubling. How can we change this, practically speaking?
Yeah, so this is really one of the things I was most happy about with belonging is that we were able to use that research, and we reproduce it here in a sidebar in the State of Religion and Young People about what that process looks like. So we were able to use the research on belonging to lay out this noticed, named, known framework. And we have just a couple of minutes, so I won't get into all the details there. But the idea is that if you can move young people through these very practical steps of noticed, named, and known, and unpack exactly what each of those are in that book, then you can reliably create a stronger sense of belonging that then changes the culture, so that you don't have to be the point person for every single one of those relationships, because as an individual, you can't possibly carry all of those. You're going to need volunteers and other trusted adults in your community and in your congregation to be helping you carry that load, and changing that culture will help create a culture of belonging.
Well, we haven't had a chance to get to all of the questions, but we're so thrilled you did tune into this webinar on the State of Religion and Young People 2020 Relational Authority. That is the name of the book, as someone's just asking in the chat right now. You can find it on Amazon right now. We just sent it off to the printer last week. You can also receive the digital copy for free, and we're able to offer the Amazon or on our website print so affordably because of a generous donor. So do pre-order now. And thank you again for taking time. To our Jewish friends who are in the midst of their high holidays, we wish you a happy new year. And as you make your way to Yom Kippur this weekend, we're sending peace to you who are practicing during this time. We will be sending a recording of this entire webinar to you, so watch your inboxes for that. You're welcome to share these resources within your own networks and communities. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks everybody.